From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Fransha Dace, who hails from the Southside Chicago neighborhood of South Shore and who is currently a Ph.D. candidate at the School of the Environment at Yale University. In this conversation, Fransha talks about the relationship between climate and language and how she has used her knowledge of Swahili to study the effects of climate change in Tanzania. She discusses her climate research, which pairs Dar es Salaam and Chicago, and examines how climate change affects the residents of these cities. She then speaks about what it means to be a researcher, who gets to conduct research, and how she hopes that universities can change to become more inclusive and welcoming to future researchers. Here's my conversation with Fransha Dace. Fransha Dace, thank you so much for being here today.
Of course.
You are from the Southside Chicago neighborhood of South Shore. You have a bachelor's degree in environmental science at Emory University and a master's degree in climate and society from Columbia University. And you are currently pursuing a Ph.D. at the Yale School of the Environment.
Yes.
And you and I met last year around this time at the Language Resource Center of Columbia, even though you're currently a Yale student.
Yeah.
And you were here because you were with Professor Abdul Nanji, who teaches Swahili language at Columbia, and you had taken that class with him. And you were telling me, and you were telling other people at the LRC, about how important it was for you to have studied Swahili in the work that you do as a researcher and PhD candidate at Yale. And I was wondering, maybe we could use that as a starting point to learn more about why language is important for you as a researcher and really learn more about your approach and interest in research in climate issues.
Great. Well, just to start off, thank you so much again for having me. We met a year ago. I think we were actually waiting for Professor Nanji, Abdul Nanji Mwalimu, which is a teacher in Swahili. We talked for a good while about the importance of language and in the work that we all do, but how I remember mentioning that it's sort of the crux, the cornerstone of my own personal dissertation work. My research centers two cities, two mid-sized, very similarly situated cities. The first one is Chicago, which is my hometown, and the second is Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, in East Africa. And we're looking at ways to adapt to the climate crisis, ways that are responsible and proactive, but also very accessible, because, an adaptation that is outside of the means of the folks who are living in these spaces is just a suggestion. And we really want to give folks the best fighting chance against this climate crisis. And for me, what I've seen in my research and in the different positions that I've had is that communities are the crux. Communities are where the crisis is felt very intimately, but it's also an opportunity. It's a stage where we can do some real and intentional good. And so that's why language is so important, because connecting to the people where they are, how they are, is a priority.
I'm very interested in the thought process that you had when you brought together these two cities. Can you talk about what led you to realize that there were enough similarities between these two cities that you felt putting them into dialogue with each other would be a useful direction for your research?
First off, I knew that I wanted to research Chicago. I knew that I wanted to get a deeper understanding outside of my own experience in the city. So outside of my family in Chicago and the piece of my heart that I've left in my hometown, Chicago is a fascinating case study in extreme flooding and extreme heat. We've seen historic weather events in the form of the 1995 heat wave and the 1999 heat wave. We've seen incredible flood events, like in the 2018 flood where the barrier wall on the south side was destroyed and unfortunately led to localized damage. But Chicago is also a major setting for a lot of the domestic climate adaptation practices that we're hoping to implement and explore. So I really wanted to study Chicago in that way and engage with the city in that way. But I also wanted to understand if my hypothesis, my thesis of the importance of communities could be replicable outside of the context of the US. And so I began a search for cities that were similar in population size and had similar riddled history of who lives where and why, because Chicago has a major history of redlining and of place based racism. I looked for a city that flooded and a city that has issues with extreme heat, and Dar es Salaam came up and kept coming up. I've done research in Tanzania in the Lake Manyara region, in villages like Rotia, towns like Karatu, places like Arusha. I've done research. And so I have some experience in the Tanzanian context. I've studied history and culture, both on site in Tanzania and here at Columbia in the LRC with Mwalimu Nanji. And so it seemed almost like magic how those two places began to align in my research, and it seemed like there was no better place to test out my hypothesis and to do my dissertation work. And so those two became my research sites.
So when you first went to Dar es Salaam, what was your impression of the city? What was your reaction? And also when was the first time that you went there?
The first time that I went to Dar es Salaam was back in 2018. It was just a visit during my time in the School for Field Studies in Tanzania. It was a research program where I studied wildlife management. It was just a weekend trip. I wish that I could have stayed longer, but it was an amazing experience. Dar es Salaam reminded me a lot of Chicago, actually, and the pace of the city. There's so much energy in both spaces. People walk with purpose as if they have somewhere to be, which seems to be a bit of a contrast to the pole pole, slowly, slowly lifestyle that I was used to in the villages. There's gorgeous art around Dar. We're right on the water, right on the Dar es Salaam harbor, which is similar to Chicago's situation on Lake Michigan. It felt almost familiar. Folks were so kind, which was just, I think, the trademark of Tanzania as a whole, just the hospitality. When my friends and I got lost, and we did get lost, folks were just so ready to help us out, and just a lot of kindness, a lot of compassion, a lot of hospitality in Dar.
How would you describe some of the ways in which this city, Dar es Salaam, has attempted to deal with climate issues? And so, what are some ways in which you feel that it's successful and other ways in which you feel that it's struggling with climate issues?
So Dar es Salaam is vulnerable to many of the different water impacts that we're seeing in relation to this climate crisis, from, major flooding to erosion on the coasts to sea level rise, even water scarcity, you name it, we're seeing it in Dar. This is because of a few reasons. So Dar es Salaam is very flat when it comes to its topography. It also has very limited and not super complex drainage networks, which negatively impacts residents. Tanzania has two major rain seasons, a short rain season and a long rain season. So this creates the perfect storm of its own, like, very intimate water related crisis. Over the past 10 or 15 years, we've noticed a number of interventions proposed and implemented by city level governing bodies. The majority of these plans include top down interventions. For example, plans to reduce saltwater intrusion in potable water resources, planned resettlement as a preventative mechanism, the tightening up of the city's emergency response systems, and things like that. These all have their utility, but we are also noticing a major gap in co-developed or community-centric approaches. And if I had to make a prediction, I would definitely say that as the issues continue to be worsened by climate change, bottom-up approaches will have to be prioritized.
It seems to me when I think about your typical like climate scientist or environmental researcher that it's more just about data, getting people to answer questions or get just numerical data. And from what you're saying, you seem to have a slightly different approach to it. And I was wondering if you could talk, your vision and your idea of how climate research should take place and what you are planning to do with it.
I want to transform what research has looked like in the past. In my experience, a lot of the time, researchers will go to a space, they'll observe, they'll get the data that they need, and then they'll leave. And when they leave, they'll publish, they'll write, they'll do their thing. And then the people that helped contribute to your work, they never get, maybe they'll get a follow-up email, but they typically don't get access to wherever the work was published. And it just feels very separate, and it also feels very irresponsible. And so to combat that, the research that I've been wanting to do is centered around the human person. I've been working to develop my survey with support from local Tanzanian folks in the research space. I've been really fortunate to have friends and Tanzanian researchers and also local Chicagoans, because I have everything that I do in Dar, I will do in Chicago. Again, this research is very community-centric, very human-centric. I will interview folks, have conversations, but I'll also receive feedback and input from the folks who are contributing to my research. I also want to make sure that I'm asking appropriate questions. And so, again, the folks that like my research team in Tanzania, these are friends of mine, but they're also researchers, and they've been really gracious about helping me ask relevant questions. I've had questions that I ask and I'll share with my friends, and they'll be like, why would you even ask us this? Like, this doesn't make any sense to ask. And I'm, humbled, but I'm also able to better prepare for what I do ask. So that's what the research will look like. I have to develop 3 publishable papers as part of my dissertation, and I'm prioritizing publishing these in journals that are open source and free, because I have access, because I go to all of these, wonderful, renowned institutions, but the people that I'm writing about can't always access even their own stories. I just can't imagine being part of a dynamic or a process or a system that separates the knowledge of a person, a human person, from that person. If I do publish, I'm working toward doing so in an open source and free journal so that I can send and share what we develop with the folks that have helped me develop it.
What you're really talking about is gatekeeping,
Yeah.
academic gatekeeping. And also, when you do research and you publish it and it's within the walled garden that you need to have, a certain affiliation to access it. Not that many people are going to read it either. So
that's true.
There's that too.
That's very true. Yeah.
Whereas if it's open source and it's available, then not only can more people read it, not only is it not hidden away and accessible only by people with a specific institutional affiliation in a specific area, in a specific economic circumstance, but also the research that you do is research that is meant, I would imagine, to be put into practice.
Yeah,
and so
that's the goal.
How are you going to put into practice something that no one can even see?
That no one can even see. And you use the word hidden, and that feels very right. It feels like we're hiding this information from people who could use it. we're hiding it through, of course, paywalls and only people with certain credentials or affiliations can access it. But we're also hiding it with inaccessible language. You know, jargon has, you know, utility. Sure, if I'm speaking to another climate adaptation scientist, maybe I'll use certain words or a certain vernacular. But to hide this knowledge essentially through these academic means, I think it honestly, it just can't. The math has never made sense to me on that.
What you're talking about is really talking about how universities should reconfigure themselves in the 21st century. Because, of course, universities are a tremendous resource, but that resource is often not deployed in a way that's beneficial to the society at large. It only benefits a small number of people.
Yep.
And one particular illustration of the positive impact that a university can have is in addressing or working to address in some way the climate crisis. Because the knowledge that we gain about how to deal with climate issues needs to be shared with people who don't have that affiliation and also don't have the insider knowledge of how a place like Yale or Columbia works. And they shouldn't have that knowledge because
I wish I didn't have this knowledge.
Yeah. And so I think that bringing it back to language, that one of the things that your work kind of illustrates is the importance of meeting people where they are, meeting people not in New Haven or New York, Morningside Heights of New York, but in Dar es Salaam, for example, or in Bangladesh, or in areas that are disproportionately shouldering the burden of the climate crisis. And I think one of the ways to do that is really through language. You know, you cannot meet people in that way just in English. So I don't know, do you agree with that? And, you know, do you see that as being part of your mission as a researcher?
I'll answer your questions with a question. Do you believe that the best ideas we can possibly have to combat the climate crisis will be from our ivory towers? Do you think that the only person who can answer a question about the climate crisis or about what it feels like to be impacted by a heat wave or a flood, do you think that the only person who can speak intelligently or proficiently about these sorts of issues are your colleagues in these universities? No. I think it's the people who are experiencing these in real time. They have a lot to say. My grandmother on my mom's side has never seen the inside of a university, but she's one of the smartest people I've ever encountered. Like, it's not even close, you know? And she can tell you all about things like recycling and how the snow was a lot higher when she was, you know, a little girl than what it is now. And she has such complex conceptions of climate change, but not even she believes that she does, you know? And so I think that the work of a researcher should be to empower your community, you know? And I'm fortunate that I have two communities that I'm working within, Chicago and Dar es Salaam. So I really see it as a responsibility. And I wish that, well, I'm hopeful that this new wave of research is going to have people who also prioritize people who have nothing to do with these institutions and everything to do with trying to survive the next climate impact or the next major weather event.
I agree. And I think that, you know, a place like Yale or Columbia from the point of view of Dar es Salaam means one thing, and from the point of view of Chicago means something else. So to kind of extend this point, when you will do your research in Chicago, how will the fact that you're coming from Yale and people, you know, will they see you as coming from Yale, or will it be that people would say, oh, you're from the South Shore neighborhood of the South Side of Chicago? How will people view you, and how will the Yale piece of what you're doing fit into what you do?
From my experience, I think I was a little intimidated to be at Yale and then come back and be the Chicagoan I've been. I remember when I first got accepted and I was like packing up, and I like barely told anybody that I was coming to Yale because I just didn't want to feel like an outsider. As someone who spent most of my life in Chicago, it's one of the things that I hold most dear, my Chicago-ness, my identity as a Chicagoan. And so coming back and doing this research as a Chicagoan who's also a Yalie has been really fascinating. I think people see me as a Chicagoan first because that's what I prioritize. Even when we were talking, I asked that you introduce me as resident of the South Shore Chicago neighborhood, because that's where my heart is, and that's what I feel like people should know. That's something that's most important about me before even my academic affiliations. My goal, my ultimate goal with attending these universities and doing work for these institutions and what have you, is to funnel all of the access that I now have because of my positionality, funnel it into the South Side of Chicago. That's my ultimate goal. That's why I'm here doing the thing. that's why I get out of bed in the morning, just with the hopes that I can make some tangible change in my own community.
What are some of the specific areas of Chicago that you feel are most pressing when it comes to the work that you want to do?
Anywhere that is not downtown or the north side of Chicago needs support. It needs extra help. In my experience, both as a researcher and as a Chicagoan, I've noticed that resources are very slow to make their way to the south and west sides of Chicago. When tragedy strikes or when a major weather event happens, downtown is immediately insulated. That's where a lot of business happens. That's where a lot of investment happens. Responsible investment doesn't always happen on the south and west sides of Chicago. It feels like the city is saying to us, you are less worthy than downtown, or you are less worthy than the north side. The city makes it clear who is most worth protecting and who isn't. I don't come from an area that, by that logic, the city feels is worth protecting, but I know Southsiders. I know Westsiders, and they are among the most worthy people I've ever encountered. They're smart and they're kind and they're so personable, and they will. I've seen folks give folks the shirts off their back. You know, I've seen people on the South Side when we realize help is gonna be slow to come from the city. I've seen South Side Chicagoans come to the rescue of other Southsiders, folks with mobility issues, maybe elderly persons being carried down flights of stairs when floods knock out elevators. I've seen people fish out important items from cars or from basements for their neighbors who can't really get to those places because of floods. I've seen people get together and whoever has the best AC just get together and hang out when heat waves happen. You know, I've seen all of this. I can't. It's difficult for me to name a worthier group of people than Southside and Westside Chicagoans. I just wish that the resources that were available to support and save and provide refuge were more accessible or reached my side of the city.
So as we've been talking, it's clear that you've spent a lot of time thinking about what research is, who gets to do research, what research should be, who participates in research, and how they should participate in it. So can you talk to me about how you conceive of the people that you do research with? What is a researcher to you?
A researcher is anybody. A researcher is my grandma. It's my aunts and my uncles, my cousins, friends from high school. A researcher is a postal worker, a teacher, a student, a teen, everybody. Anybody can be a researcher. Anybody with thoughts in their mind have the capability of research and of doing great research at that. One thing that I've been really excited and fortunate about in terms of my own research is I've been hiring people. I've been hiring folks. Um, I did a small pilot study on the south side of Chicago, and I needed a lot of help with it. So I hired all sorts of people, retirees, teachers, Uber drivers, students, high schoolers, community college folks. I've hired all sorts of people who sort of represent Chicago and Chicagoans to help give me advice or to consult on the questions that I'm asking. I'm also interviewing them to just see how the climate crisis is impacting them or how they've been able to navigate extreme heat and extreme flood events. And to some researchers who turn around and say, I'm gonna put this on my resume, or who say like, I didn't know I could do it, or wow, I did it. And that to me is just about as rewarding as it gets.
So what would you say then to somebody who thinks, oh, I'm a Uber driver, or I'm just a regular person, I'm not a researcher? What would you tell them? Or maybe someone who's interested in doing research, but maybe they don't feel authorized to do it. How would you, given your experiences at Columbia and at Yale, what would you say to that person who feels that way?
I would first acknowledge that there are systems in place to keep folks feeling stagnant and like they're just XYZ. And then I would also acknowledge that anyone can do research. If you're driving one path and you know that there's construction on that path next week and you drive on a different path, you just did science. Like, you just had a hypothesis and you tested it and you are performing research. We do research and science every single day, every day of our lives, and it's just not always praised or given the title as research or science, unless you're in an institution like Yale or Columbia. I think that's really unfortunate. I think it's an opportunity to celebrate the day-to-day science that we do, and I think that's also what makes it so fun. Intangible. It's research isn't always peer-reviewed papers and spreadsheets. It's your lived experience, whatever that looks like.
On this podcast, I've talked about my lived experience as, growing up with an Italian background and sort of discovering that, and then the circumstances in which I grew up. And so from that perspective, the overarching feeling that I had when I went to Yale initially, because I was there for 7 years,
right. Yeah.
was, who am I to do this? Who am I to publish this kind of thing? And that's the way I think most people feel.
Yeah.
And the number one thing that I learned, and it took 7 years, was the positive sense of entitlement, not the sense of, feeling like I need to show off to other people or be rude to them, but the sense like, yes, I should do this. I'm going to do this. And who cares? I have every right to do this.
Yeah, who else but me?
Yeah. And so I think that that's part of perhaps what you might be wishing to do in your research.
Absolutely.
Is to share with people like, you're entitled to do this.
You have a place here. Yeah. That's something that I didn't hear a lot of in my academic pursuit, that I was usually one of, I don't know, at Emory, maybe one of two Black women pursuing my science, or one of one Black humans at Columbia, currently one of, I think maybe we're up to 8 now in Yale's Ph.D. program in terms of Black folks, Black persons. And so it's, if I didn't hear it out loud, I definitely felt it in the classroom of you don't belong here, or we haven't made room for you. So yeah, I do see it as one of my personal missions that I'm so happy to take on, to tell people that you have a place here, or that we'll make room for you, or that you command room, and we'll just adapt. One of my one thing that I've learned along the way in these institutions has been to sort of remix my imposter syndrome, that voice in my head that says, man, they're not going to listen to a little girl from the south side of Chicago. They're not going to, like, why would they? You know, why does that make sense? Or like, how did you even get here in these rooms? One thing that I do is say, wow, okay, I feel like I don't belong here. And I feel like maybe they made a mistake, or maybe I just tricked everybody. And maybe I'm just the greatest to ever do it because I am a kid from the South Side, and you don't see too many people like me doing it. And so just remixing it, and like, if I can finesse everybody into believing that I'm somebody, either A, maybe I am somebody, or B, I deserve to be here in the first place. If I can do all of that. So
Definitely. But let me ask you this, since you mentioned it, what should it be like, in your opinion? How should a place like Yale look, and what should it be like for a person from the south side of Chicago?
personally, I don't think I'll stop fighting until we have entire classrooms full of Black students outside of the AFAM department, because that's where many of my friends are. Yeah, I like to think of what it would look like. So first off, visioning is something that I hold really near and dear to my work, to my science, to my life. Visioning what can be, releasing ourselves from the boxes that we put on ourselves or what other folks put on us, so that we can see a bright, creative, post climate crisis future. And I don't know, I think it would be really cool to have a day, to come to a day where no one would say anything about an all Black woman classroom of PhD students, like an all Black woman class cohort of PhD students. They do it every day with white students, white male students in particular. They've had entire classes without a single person of color, and no one says anything. So one day, the statistics, the data, whatever, one day I'd like to think that there will be an all Black woman class cohort of PhD students at Yale University, and no one will say anything because it's just something that can happen. At In the Yale School of the Environment, we have this building called Sage Hall. And if you go to the second floor of Sage Hall and go to the back, you will see framed class photos lining the walls, and it goes all the way back to I think like 1902 or 1901. And you can just see these gentlemen in their suits, and I don't have to tell you what they look like, but I will. They're all white men. And you can go through the years, and I think maybe the first person who looked like me, the first Black woman or the first Black person, I don't think they came into the late 60s or the 70s. And then from there, you see a little more gender diversity and a little more like racial diversity as you go further down the stairs. And yeah, that's a place that I studied very often. It's a place where Sage Hall is a place where a lot of life has happened for my cohort and I, and to be constantly reminded of the history of who was allowed and who the space was created for. I don't know, it weighs on you, but it also has energized me to help make sure that I'm not the last, not even close.